Hi, Brian. How are you?
Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadlines. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, a podcast about writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Moritz. Today's guest is legendary sportscaster Bob Costas. Well, this is a big thrill for me to say, but Bob Costas, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Brian. How you doing?
I'm honestly starstruck. You probably
Stop.
You probably get this a lot, but no. And I wrote about this on my blog a few months ago that when the news came out about you and NBC. I mean, when I was growing up and wanted to be a broadcaster, you were the guy I wanted to grow up to be like. So, this is honestly just the biggest thrill for me to be able to talk to you today about sports media and stuff like that.
Well, let's make the most of it and hope that neither one of us screws it up.
Sounds like a good plan, and it's always good to talk to a fellow Syracuse graduate as well. So what are some of your memories looking back at Syracuse at your time there in the 70s? I mean, what do you remember? What do you kind of still take from your time at Syracuse and in Syracuse in your career now?
Well, it's an ongoing relationship. Those of us who made our mark, or at least began our broadcasting careers in a certain sense at Syracuse, remain attached. And the list is so long, dozens of broadcasters, many of them, perhaps most sportscasters, but not confined to that. Ted Koppel, Dick Clark, Jeff Glor, who now anchors the CBS Evening News. So there's a whole network of us out there, and most of us go back as often as we can and speak to classes, and we've been proud to see the expansion of the Newhouse School and how it keeps getting better and better and how it really does live up to its reputation. A lot of people are interested in Syracuse because of the prominent names who have attended, but that's not enough. When you get there, it has to pay off, and from everything I can tell, they continue to be state-of-the-art and live up to their reputation. When I was there in the early 70s, the thing that I remember most is just being around so many like-minded people who had the same interests that I had. We pushed each other. We forged, in many cases, lifelong friendships. We had a whole lot of fun, and that was when we figured out whether we had any chance at all to be good broadcasters if we worked at it, because Syracuse at that time, not unique, but rare among universities. Now it's become standard, but at that time, Syracuse was among the few that let you, beginning with your freshman year, be on the campus radio station. And they had campus television facilities as well. You know, it's important to do well in a classroom, but you can't learn to be a broadcaster in a classroom. Mm-hmm. The only way you can learn it is by doing it. Find out if you have some kind of knack for it, and then refine that talent as you go along.
Who are some of your mentors at Syracuse? Who were some of the professors who were there that kind of left a mark on you?
Well, the biggest was Professor Stan Alton, who passed away about a year or so ago. Again, a lifelong relationship. His area of expertise was audio. In fact, he wrote some textbooks that became kind of the Bible of television audio, especially for sports events, the way you'd mix audio, the difference between a tennis match and a football game and that sort of thing. So in that respect, you wouldn't think that Stan, by his expertise, would be more connected to me than any other student. But for some reason, I took one class of his, only one, but for some reason he had some kind of feeling that I had a chance to be good at it. And he would critique what I did both on the campus radio station and then at WSYR in Syracuse during my senior year when I got a job broadcasting minor league hockey and anchoring the weekend sports. He would critique everything I did. And he thought I had a lot of ability and a lot of potential, but he was unsparing in his criticism. And that criticism continued even after I was at NBC. In my early days at NBC in the 80s, from time to time, he would call me and say, you know, you did this well, but you could have done this better. So he continued to be a caring mentor for a long, long time, and we were friends until the very day he passed away.
What class did you take from him, just out of curiosity?
It was an audio class. I forget what it was called.
Okay. And you mentioned how you and a lot of the alums do come back. And I remember the time that when I was in grad school, when I was there, that you came back, but I couldn't come, or for a funny reason, was you did a panel, which I found funny because I looked it up, and it was When Rights Collide: Sports Coverage versus Branding, and it was about the free speech rights of sports journalists compared with contract and property rights of networks, teams, and universities. And I find that interesting because 10 years later, and that's still a conversation we're having in sports media.
Yeah, it's an unusual relationship in that, regardless of how anyone feels about any of these various outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they don't pay rights fees to cover the White House or any other news story. And neither does the Chicago Tribune or the Washington Post or the Syracuse Post-Standard pay to cover the games of the teams and events they cover. However, the network that carries the games has exclusive rights to those games, and they purchase them for considerable amounts of money. So that creates a kind of partnership. It's not always an equal partnership. In the case, as I've said recently, of the networks and the NFL, it tilts heavily toward the NFL. They have all the leverage. And so it creates a different dynamic than if you were just straight out covering events as news stories. It's kind of a hybrid, and everybody approaches it in different ways. I know I approached it differently than almost anybody else among my contemporaries, and I believe that was the right way, at least for me. Sometimes it created tension, but I'm comfortable with it because I think I did the right thing.
How would you describe that way that you would handle that relationship?
Well, I think what I did was over time, not every single broadcast can embody all of these aspects, but the example I've used is that a good edition of Sports Illustrated has celebrations of sports, beautiful photography that captures the artistry and sometimes almost the poetry of sports. It has history. It has humor. It has appreciations. It has profiles, but it also has journalism and commentary. And in that prototypical edition of Sports Illustrated, you get the whole spectrum, or at least over time, you get the whole spectrum. All the shadings are filled in, and at a high level of quality, where credibility and talent in terms of the writing all matter and all come together. So you're trying to have all those aspects addressed at a level of high quality. That's what I tried to do. Could I get every aspect into every broadcast? No. But those who think, and maybe some think this if they only paid attention in the last few years, those who think that my only interest was in the journalistic side of sports either weren't around or weren't paying attention in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s when I was doing the NBA and doing baseball and hosting the Olympics, and very few people ever appreciated the drama, the history, the shared human experience of sports any more than I did. And I think I did a good job of highlighting those things. But at the same time, if I was to interview a commissioner or the head of the IOC or a player involved in one controversy or another, I approached that as journalistically as I could. I approached that as if the person was on Meet the Press, and I believe that was the right thing to do. And I think that over time, if somebody looks at what I did with a clear and fair eye, there was a lot of humor in there. There was a lot of quirkiness. There was a lot of fun. There was a lot of drama and excitement. But there was also an appropriate level of journalism and commentary. That's what I tried to do.
And it's, like I said, it's been 10 years since we had that panel at Syracuse. And I'm wondering, do you think that kind of tension, that push and pull, that relationship, has it gotten any more difficult to navigate in the last 10, 15 years or so? Or is it any different than it was back in the 80s and 90s when you were coming up and in your heyday at NBC?
I think it's probably more difficult for a couple of reasons. the rights fees are ever more significant. So there's even more at stake for the networks. Also, the attention span of audiences, or at least the way television people perceive those attention spans, works against long-form interviews, works against a follow-up question, works against a commentary that has much depth to it. And then you have the fear factor of the networks wondering if they'll ruffle the feathers of this entity or that. So it was always kind of a tightrope walk when it comes to the network's relationships with the leagues. But now I think that tightrope is even more narrow.
Changing gears just a little bit, because this is a podcast, we generally talk a lot about writing and writers and that aspect of media. And obviously you're known for broadcasting, but I'm wondering how much does, and to this day currently, how much is writing a part of your job and what you do?
It was probably more a part of my job than most, because especially in the last 15 to 20 years, I hosted more than I did play-by-play. I've done play-by-play the last several years for the Major League Baseball Network, which I enjoy very much, but it's not as broadly seen as the work I did on NBC. So as a host, sometimes I was ad-libbing, sometimes I wrote what I presented, especially the halftime essays on the NFL games or some of the stuff on the Olympics. And I was very flattered when someone wrote recently that I was like a columnist on the air. Mm-hmm. Not always when you're doing play-by-play or various other things. I mean, I did a wide variety of things over the years, but there were times, I think, when that would be an apt description, that I was like a columnist on the air. Mm-hmm. And I've always had an appreciation for good writing, for broadcasters who had a command of language. I grew up appreciating the Jack Whitakers, the Vin Scullys, the Jim McKays, people who express themselves elegantly. Mm-hmm. And while that's a high standard to reach, that was what I attempted.
So kind of approaching those commentaries and that hosting duties in a way of a columnist, I mean, what was your approach to writing that? How much did you script out versus kind of ad-lib, or how much research did you do in that? Kind of what was your process in terms of writing out those things?
Well, it varied from circumstance to circumstance. When Al Davis died, a man with an estimable and impactful career in the NFL, that required a little bit more thought than writing a halftime essay about the upcoming Peyton Manning-Tom Brady duel next Sunday night on NBC. The latter, I probably wrote at some point during the first quarter of the game, banged it out in 10 or 15 minutes, and that was fine. When Al Davis died, I took several hours to write it on a Saturday afternoon in the hotel. I think we were in Atlanta that weekend and doing a Sunday night game that night, because it required a little bit more nuance. And also I had to ask for a little bit more time, and that extra 45 seconds or so to do it justice. Those are the dynamics of television that you have to work around. And then there were also a lot of times, and the audience just couldn't tell because you become, you would hope, fairly adept at ad-libbing. There were a lot of times when I was ad-libbing entirely, or I was ad-libbing in and around bullet points or in and around something that was scripted, and then I'd insert stuff parenthetically and come back to the script. So I guess I haven't really answered the question completely, Brian, but it varied from circumstance to circumstance.
And kind of walk me through that process. I teach mostly what we would one time consider print journalism courses, but we have a huge broadcast program at Oswego where I teach. And there is, that idea of writing to time and the challenges that presents, because it's not so much writing like 500 words or 1,000 words or something like that. It's writing like for 45 seconds, and you don't get 46 seconds. So what's that like writing for writing to time versus kind of writing to word length?
Eventually you get a sense. If someone says 45 seconds, if you script something out, either in your head with bullet points or truly write it, if you've done it long enough, you're going to come within a couple of seconds on either side of 45. You just have that clock in your head. I remember watching Bryant Gumbel when he hosted in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when he hosted a lot of stuff for NBC. And he was just remarkably good at it. And when I arrived at NBC, they told me, if you tell Bryant Gumbel, we need a minute, no script, he'd give you between 58 and 61 seconds just off the top of his head. He just knew how to do it. Who knows why? You know, does it change the course of Western civilization? No. But those of us who do it for a while and are lucky enough to have that knack, you just kind of figure out how to do it. I would say a good exercise, and maybe you've thought of this already, for your writing classes is to listen to some of Frank DeFord's weekly commentaries on NPR. And he collected his favorites in, I think it was the last book that he wrote. He really didn't write it. He edited it. He pulled it together, an anthology of his NPR essays entitled, I'd Know That Voice Anywhere. Now, here's Frank DeFord, who made his reputation, and it was a rightly exalted reputation, by doing long-form takeout pieces in Sports Illustrated, lengthy pieces. And yet he was able to craft these much shorter pieces for NPR, and they still had a beginning, a middle, and an end, a narrative thread, and they made sense and worked in that context. So here was a guy that could go long or short with equal effect.
I'm curious. You mentioned some of the broadcasters you listened to and idolized when you were coming up and growing up. Who are some of the writers and maybe the sports writers that you read growing up that you remember that had an influence on you?
Well, interestingly, Dick Young, who wrote for the New York Daily News primarily throughout his career, he had a kind of punchy style, short, quick sentences. I kind of think that if he had a favorite novelist, I knew Dick a little bit, but I never asked him this. If he had a favorite novelist, I would guess that Ernest Hemingway might have been that novelist. You know, short, quick, to the point, nothing overly flowery, very effective for a columnist at a New York tabloid. And what tabloid meant then is different than what people think of now. We're talking about, not talking about the National Enquirer or something like that. We're talking about a kind of street smart New York newspaper. There were many of them. People like Jimmy Breslin and Jimmy Cannon and Pete Hamill wrote for those newspapers. And on the sports side, people like Dick Young were kind of a must-read for sports fans. But then on the other hand, Dan Jenkins, his novels, his pieces in Sports Illustrated. Later, Rick Riley, a combination of heart and humor. Steve Rushin, writing these days in Sports Illustrated, writes with great humor and always seems to find something off the beaten path that's different than anything else that you're reading anywhere else. I'm leaving a lot of people out. Tom Verducci is the best baseball journalist working right now because he pulls all the aspects together. Journalism, understanding of history, a keen eye for detail, and a literary touch. There are many others, but I just, as I said at the beginning, a thought well expressed is important. When you look around today, in a Twitter world, people expressing themselves in 140 characters, or maybe now they've added a few characters to it, but it isn't much. People yelling at each other in sound bites on these shows that are supposedly debate shows, and they're mostly heat over light shows. If you're of a certain sensibility, you appreciate a thought well crafted and well expressed, even if those things appear to be on the endangered species list these days.
It does, but I also get the feeling, and maybe you do too, I'd love your thoughts on this, that there's almost like a renewed appreciation in a lot of the longer form piece and that type of writing and that type of commentary and thinking that you've mentioned. It's almost like we had this big binge in all media, but maybe particularly sports media, and it's still there, of the Twitter shouting and like the talking head argument shows. But then we're kind of like, I feel like there's this movement of, you know, people appreciating a longer form piece and the ability to kind of have either or. And I'm wondering if you've kind of noticed that at all.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Bill Simmons, who is one of the very first breakout internet stars, and you think that the internet is not necessarily encouraging or rewarding those sorts of thoughtful, lengthy pieces, but it's Bill Simmons who created Grantland and then The Ringer, where quality writers get the room to do what they do best. So that's a very good thing. I don't know if the overall group of consumers appreciates that sort of thing as much as they once did, but I do know, in light of the tone of everything else that's out there, for many of us, it's a welcome breath of fresh air. It's an antidote to a lot of what's out there when you see something that respects the audience's intelligence and doesn't operate from the premise that the reader or viewer has the attention span of a gnat.
Thinking back and just thinking of the writers you mentioned and growing up on Long Island when you did, I mean, to be reading Dick Young and Jimmy Breslin and Jimmy Cannon, I mean, that's a murderer's row of all time great newspaper columnists to be able to read growing up. I'm as jealous of anything as the fact that you got to read those guys daily in your prime. What newspapers did you guys get growing up at your house? Just wondering.
The Daily Mirror, which is now extinct, long gone. The New York Daily News, the New York Post, the New York Times, and Newsday, the Long Island paper.
Right. Wow, you got five.
I read all of them from the time that I was like 10 years old.
Wow.
Now, the New York Times, I have to admit, I didn't roll up my sleeves and get into anything other than the sports section of the New York Times until I was about 18 and in college. I was going to the sports pages first in all those papers. But, by osmosis, you're kind of steeped in the sensibility that prevailed. And especially the tabloids had that kind of street smart New York sensibility about them. And it was just something that became part of how you viewed the world.
So I know you've told this story many times, but I would love it if you indulge me on this one. And I was listening to this last night, getting ready for the podcast. Your Ogie Oglethorpe story from your time in Syracuse, covering as the voice of the hockey team here. And if you're a fan of Slapshot, some of these names and ideas are probably going to be familiar to you.
Yeah, the starting point is, if you've seen Slapshot, the character Ogie Oglethorpe is based directly, not loosely, on Bill Goldie Goldthorpe of the Syracuse Blazers. And Slapshot is based on the old Eastern Hockey League. The Blazers were a part of that league. They were an especially good team. They won championships, played in the Syracuse War Memorial, and Goldthorpe was the hockey enforcer of all enforcers. He's legendary in hockey circles. Might have been the most penalized and certainly the most frequently suspended player in hockey history. I think there were half dozen leagues from which he was suspended for life. He was arrested multiple times. He's calmed down now, lives peacefully in Canada. He has a memoir coming out for which I wrote the foreword only a few months ago. Yeah. But in the 1973-74 season, I was a senior at Syracuse, and I got the job broadcasting the games for $30 a game and $5 a day meal money on the road. And the Eastern Hockey League, which then became the North American Hockey League, was a bus league. And except in the playoffs, you never stayed overnight. So you'd drive 7 hours from Syracuse to Johnstown on the bus, play the game in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, turn around, ride the bus back all night long, arrive at dawn, at which point I would probably go to my 8 a.m. class because I was trying to finish up my senior year as well. So at one point in the season, we're rumbling down the New York Thruway or some such highway headed for Johnstown, and I'm sitting there minding my own business, reading, funny you should ask, the New York Times. And Goldthorpe, who had little use for me because he evaluated people at that point in his life based on how he thought they would do in a back alley fight or in a saloon somewhere. And so he reaches over my shoulder, yanks the New York Times from my hands, stands up in the aisle of the bus, rips it into shreds, and then lets it fall on the floor like New Year's Eve confetti. And I probably should have let it pass, but all the players were now looking at us, and Goldthorpe is standing there chortling. So I thought I had to say something, and I looked up at him and I said, "Hey, Goldie, don't be jealous. I'll teach you to read." And that got a laugh from some of the players, but not from Goldie. And he yanked me out of my seat, and he slammed me up against the wall of a moving bus up against the window. And he was so strong, and I was so light at that point. I probably weighed 130 pounds. And so with one hand, he's got me pinned against the window, and he reaches up with the other hand and pulls down a hacksaw from the luggage rack. The players use the hacksaw to trim their sticks. And so he puts the hacksaw beneath my chin. And I know, even in that moment of panic, he really doesn't intend to decapitate me. But I am also pretty sure that he's not the sort of fella who would take into account all the possibilities. What if the bus swerves to avoid a deer on the road? It hits a pothole, whatever. And then some unintended consequences might ensue. So I don't know how long I was up against the wall. It seemed like an eternity. It was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. And the players from the front of the bus, where the veterans sat, it was kind of a seniority seating arrangement, and the coach and the veteran players were toward the front of the bus, and they started to make their way back toward us like a makeshift SWAT team. And I remember, I think his last name was Barber. I can't remember if it was Butch Barber or Bill Barber. He had a brother who played for the Flyers on their Stanley Cup teams in the NHL. So it was one Barber or the other. And he's making his way toward the back of the bus, leading this SWAT team. And he's saying, Goldie, put Bob down, put the hacksaw down, put Bob down. And eventually he did both. And actually from that point on, things got better between me and Goldthorpe, because I think he actually respected the fact that I stood up for myself in a certain sense. And now we're like big buddies.
It's very lucky that you hit the only smooth patch of interstate in upstate New York or Pennsylvania at
Correct.
The time of that. I ask every guest on the podcast this, so I'll ask you, what is the best thing that you've read lately?
The best thing I've read lately, I'm trying to, of late, if we're counting lately, it's all periodicals and newspapers and stuff online as I get ready for the baseball season. Tyler Kepner, the terrific baseball writer for the New York Times, has a new book out where he sees the game through the backstory of prominent pitchers through the years. And I've just begun to crack that. But I can't, off the top of my head, I haven't read any of the great American novels lately.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Dan Jenkins earlier. I just got a couple of his books the last week after he passed away, and I just started reading for the first time You Gotta Play Hurt. And just you were right, just kind of like the very unique style, but the vibrancy of his writing is just staggering. Like that's, the ultimate kind of packing a lot into short, concise sentences. I mean, it's such a unique style. It's like you can't imitate it. You could probably try and fail, but it's very, very so unique and so singular.
Yeah, great writers have a voice, just the same as the best broadcasters have a voice. Without a byline, without a picture, if you're reading a Dan Jenkins piece, it's Dan Jenkins. Although the Daily News' staff has shrunk in recent years, if you read a Mike Lupica column, it's Mike Lupica because he has a distinctive voice. That was true of Jimmy Breslin. It's true of Pete Hamill. It's true now of Verducci. It was true of Rick Riley and many others. But if you're going to kind of jump out of the pack, you have to have a distinctive voice.
All right. Well, Bob, this has been a treat. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Nice talking with you.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and every episode can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. Technical assistance this week provided by Bob Hotchkiss and Dixon Schwabel Advertising. Enormous thanks this week to Dave Cohen, Eileen Billinson, and Dr. Jennifer Billinson for making this happen. Our theme music, as always, is by Ellie Moritz.